I have a really cool pleasure today of introducing someone that has become a friend that I've known for now a good number of years, and want to just go beyond the traditional introduction where, of course, Reinhard Bütikofer, the chairman of the Alliance 90 Greens since December 2002, has been a key part of really the ascendance of the Green Party into politically significant and consequential. I know this is dangerous territory, but you know, the Green Party matters today, and I would argue that while it probably always did matter, there are different levels of traction that one gets politically, and the Green Party today has a very, very different level of traction, and of course it did when it was allied with the Social Democrats during a very period of time. I had the pleasure of being a guest at the Heinrich Böll Foundation. I want to also acknowledge Helga Flores-Trejo, the fabulous director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation here in Washington, who, along with myself and a group of ladies, we were invited to attend the Green Party convention in Dresden. And it was one of the really great experiences of my life. I didn't know Reinhard well then, but by the end of this convention I did. I was buying beer, I was buying books. I shouldn't acknowledge this on camera, but I was trying to help you. Because there is, in fact, within the Green Party, like any faction, whether you're the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, there are factions of thought, power, and whatnot. And these were fun to watch and see. And I got much more of an understanding of some of the internal dynamics of political parties, the Realos, the Fundis. You know, you can accept, but I had fun playing both sides. Probably broke all sorts of campaign finance laws in Germany with the beers that I was buying people to encourage them to vote one way or the other with their little machines. But in any case, I've become a fan of Reinhard Bütikofer and watched his role in shaping a party that has a kind of, well, it does have an ideological direction. It is a values-based political party worried about big issues about environment, about human rights, about the kind of DNA side. And I used to joke around about it, but it's not so much of a joke, and I mean it in a nice and not a mean way. To some degree, there are some elements that are similar to, I'll say, both kind of a German neocon operation, or if you read Anne-Marie Slaughter, a member of my board, the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, and kind of Wilsonian thinking, her new book on a values-based foreign policy and the idea that as America also would be a kind of American version of some of the principles that the Green Party talked about. Reinhard Bütikofer is one of the types of people who's a jack of all trades and can address almost any kind of public policy issue. And I heard him give a talk last year which was mesmerizing, that dealt with climate change, environment, not from a traditional perspective of what you might have expected from a progressive left green type, but someone who is deeply realistic and thoughtful about the mechanics of changing the way in which energy use and consumption is managed and what might make. I really wish we had more discussions at that kind of serious level in Washington. But another level issue interests me, and that is the question of what is this world going to look like in 5 or 10 years? What is the deployment of force and power to achieve great ends going to look like? What is the relative weight of the United States in the world today, given the fact that I think that there are sets of voids, and in my view, and this is my own bias, the mystique of America's place in the world has been somewhat punctured, and it has created different kinds of realities. Our allies are not behaving as the way our allies used to do. They don't count on us as much. Our enemies are moving agendas in their ways. The global equilibrium of interest has been thrown off. And I've been interested in Europe struggling and figuring out how it positions itself to fill this space as far as sculpting what a future geopolitical order looks like. How robust is its involvement going to be, or how factionalized and impotent will its involvement be? There was a case, and I can now talk about it publicly. Bob Cooper, who's a very senior official at the European Union, once told me a story about John Bolton. John Bolton was responsible for communicating the change in the U.S. position about Europe taking a leading role in negotiating then with Iran. This was at the very beginning. We had resisted Europe's interest in playing that, which would have been, and which was the first time that Europe stepped out of its shell to tackle a major global strategic problem on its own. And John Bolton at this meeting mumbled the change in U.S. policy, which he didn't like. Mumbled it, said it quickly, and refused to state it again. It was sort of a a childish antic at some level, because someone's going to put out a piece of paper, or the secretary will say, but at the meeting you didn't want to do it. And that was the beginning of our very awkward arrangement with Europe in terms of trying to struggle in dealing with Iran. It was a silly, amateurish, almost childish antic of someone who didn't want to communicate and be the carrier of the change in U.S. policy that, yes, said to Europe, we look forward to you stepping forward, negotiating with Iran, and seeing where we'll go. It's been an up and down and a process full of twists and turns. And I am intrigued and grateful that Reinhard Bütikofer is joining us today to talk about this. And I should also add that I'm going to be here for Reinhard's speech and talk. Helga Flores-Trejo is going to handle questions and Q&A, as I have to interview someone who might be the successor for the next head of the New America Foundation. It's something I ought not to miss if I want to continue doing these kinds of things we're doing today. So without further ado, please welcome my friend Reinhard Bütikofer to share with us his view of, does Europe matter in our engagement with Iran? Reinhard Bütikofer.
Well, thanks a lot, Steve, for this introduction. It's more than kind and not really justified. But I take it as a salute to the party rather than the person. You've asked me to talk about a German view on this topic, and I want to underline that in the beginning again. It's not the German view. It's a German view, and whatever shortcomings it might have, hold it against me. I know that there are many people in the room that probably know a lot more about the issue than I do, but I still welcome this opportunity to have a discussion. Iran continues its enrichment of uranium against the unanimous will of the international community as expressed in UN Security Resolution 1737 in December 2006. The latest relevant resolution by the UN Security Council, Resolution 1747, was passed in March. And at the time, not only did this resolution promise to pass more measures in the future if Iran wouldn't come around within 60 days. Also, on this very same day, the 5+1 nations indicated that they did respect the right of Iran to use nuclear enrichment, that they wanted to negotiate, and that they would, on the other side, be willing to pass a third resolution, including more sanctions before summer if they would not be successful. Now, in the meantime, as far as I know, there hasn't been any progress. There has been a numerous sequence of meetings between the European High Representative Solana and Mr. Larijani. The next important meeting is coming up on June 23rd in Lisbon, but there are not very high hopes that this will change the present course. At the same time, the IAEA continues its inspections, and in its latest report dating from May 23rd, it establishes that it has been unable to say that the nuclear program in Iran is exclusively for peaceful purposes, but at the same time, it also has no proof that the use of enriched nuclear material is for other than peaceful purposes. So it's undecisive. How far have the Iranians got? According to a pronouncement of the Iranian president, Iran reached the level of industrial enrichment in April this year, which would mean they have more than 3,000 centrifuges to work on the enrichment process. Now, the IAEA is more skeptical there. They allow for about half of that, which would mean there would still be some way to go for Iran. The Israeli Mossad has told the Knesset late last year that they expect Iran, to be able to build a bomb by 2009, while other experts allow for a longer period till that might happen. What do we make of that? I think we have to put these facts about the Iranian nuclear program in a wider context. Is it the Iranian president that we're having problems with, Ahmadinejad? Is it the Iranian leadership? Or is it the Iranian people? I would say it definitely is Ahmadinejad, and to a large degree it's the ruling class, the ruling political class, but I would also agree with Israeli President Peres, who said in Herzliya that it's not the Iranian people we're having problems with. But how can we make that difference a practical perspective? Where are we going to in trying to solve the problem? Is the goal of the international community to restore the kind of patron-client relationship that the United Nations once had with Iran during the tenure of the Shah? Are we going to try to build a new relationship that acknowledges modern Iran as a partner, as a positive part of a regional order? I think if we talk about the problems we have with that nuclear program, we have to discuss these broader issues also. And I think it's a shortcoming, particularly of the US approach, that it has tended to narrow the discussion to the nuclear issue as such, and has been reluctant to offer opportunities for the wider picture. I believe that there's not going to be change in the Iranian policy without pressure from its outside. And I also believe that there's not going to be a chance for change if all we offer is pressure alone. So it's about the right mix of sticks and carrots. Right now, I see a three-pronged approach which relies on diplomacy, sanctions, and what I would call a kind of shadow coalition of the willing. Diplomacy is obvious. I don't have to talk a lot about it. Sanctions are sometimes considered weak in this case. And obviously, these are definitely not the most stringent sanctions you could think of. But I think in this case, the questions whether these sanctions are weak or not rests more on the question of who supports the sanctions. And I think it's extremely important and valuable to have a unity of the international community supporting these sanctions in the UN Security Council. I think if we would allow this international coalition to split up, if we would allow the Russians or the Chinese to leave that concerted effort, whatever we would do instead of what we're doing now would be weaker, because it would allow the Iranians to interpret the conflict as a conflict not between the international community and Iran, but between the West and Iran. And it would allow other countries to forego their responsibility in the international theater. And therefore, I believe it is important to keep discussing whether we can get more stringent sanctions, but the measure is what we can do and keep the 5 members of the Security Council on board at the same time. But then there's this third part to the strategy, which I call the shadow coalition of the willing. I met a CEO of a major German financial institution last year in Munich when he just came out of the meeting with Secretary Kimmett, who had showed him some documents of financial transactions that some dependency of his company had been doing somewhere in the Caribbean. And of course, Kimmett didn't show it to the CEO just in order to inform him. He made a point, and I think this point was not lost, not on this manager, and it was, I know there have been other cases of that too. So behind a curtain, there is a second set of, I would say, shadow sanctions that are not formally agreed, but are much more stringent, where financial institutions are convinced, maybe persuaded, maybe pressured, maybe, to think twice about their economic relation with Iran. And I think this is valuable too. This should not be played off against the other two levels of action. I think it has already produced some results, because obviously the economic development in Iran is not satisfactory from the point of view of the government, and partly because of that, President Ahmadinejad got clobbered in the last local elections, which I think is clearly a sign of hope. Still, this three-pronged approach has not been successful in moving the Iranians to where we want to have them. So the question, of course, arises, what else can the international community do? I think that there should be more emphasis on human rights issues, but not within the framework of a concept of regime change, but rather within the framework of a concept of regime transformation. I don't believe that we're about to see the immediate downfall of the Iranian regime. There's no immediate domestic change if you talk about regime change, not very probable. But there can be change for the better, and I think it would be a mistake for the international community, and sometimes I feel the Europeans are committing that mistake, not to raise human rights issues at the same time when you do all the other things. Sometimes the impression arises that we're not raising these issues because we hope that the negotiation should not be hampered by more conflicts and more issues we have with Afghanistan, with Iran. There's one dimension that is clearly more popular in this city than in any city in Europe, and that's the military dimension. I agree with all those who argue that even the threat of military force is unproductive and not helpful, and indeed more detrimental than helpful, because it undercuts any credibility for any inner Iranian moderate alternative. I go one step further. I think the use of military force, and this is being discussed as we know, would do more harm to the strategic cooperation between the United States and Europe than almost any other development I could think of. And I'm not saying this from an ideological point of view. In the German context, the Greens are the one party that support the war in Afghanistan more than any other. we had a poll recently indicating that 44% of the public supports staying in Afghanistan and 54 are in favor of getting out. Now, there was a very slim majority in favor of staying with the conservatives. The Free Democrats were evenly split. The left parties were clearly against. Only the Green Party had a majority of 57 in favor and 39 for getting out. So clearly we have a realistic general perspective on even the use of military force in international relations. But still, I think it would be a gross mistake to go in that direction. And I'm clearly convinced that if the United States went in that direction, it would find less allies in Europe than in the case of Iraq. I know that Jack Straw, whose ascendancy is to be expected with a new Brown government, at some point a couple of years ago even clearly expressed that Britain would not be part of that effort. And I'm sure that a military action would not even fail to prevent this ongoing nuclear program from getting what it wants. It might even end up in uniting the Iranian nation behind those crooks who are putting forward the program. So I believe that international cooperation is key, and we should make sure that we will not lose that. I think that threatening military force pleases only the hardliners. It may please some hardliners here in the Vice President's office, but it definitely pleases more hardliners in Tehran in the entourage of President Ahmadinejad. And it portrays all those who believe that there could be a deal struck between Iran and the West, and the US in particular. If Iran changed its course, those would be perceived as naive, utterly naive, unrealistic, and not offering a real option. I believe there's no way of avoiding dialogue. Avoiding dialogue is not an option, and as the United States government has started a dialogue with Iran on the Iraqi issue, I think that could be a starting point. And we should offer Iran a different perspective, including much improved ties with the United States. In the end, it will all boil down to facilitating Iranian decision-making to really offer different options. Are we able to avoid Iran to complete the enrichment process, to close the fuel cycle? I'm very skeptical that we can achieve avoiding that. Are we able to achieve preventing the building of the Iranian bomb? I think we're able to achieve that. We can avoid the building of the Iranian bomb. It's quite conceivable to put an enrichment process under international surveillance or under international control. There have been proposals to that effect. Or it could be conceivable to combine the international acceptance of an Iranian fuel cycle with the Iranian acceptance of the need of international surveillance. Clearly, this is not the next step. But I believe that we have to continue working on all the different levels, including the official sanctions that are weak superficially, that draw their strength from the unity they express, from the legitimacy that this gives to the whole process, including the shadow sanction and everything. Let me end by adding two more sentences on what I would call two sideshows of these discussions. One is on Turkey, one is on Syria. I think when we want to consider changing the course of events, it's extremely important to take note of the fact that there might be opportunities to separate Syria from Iran. And I think that all the initiatives that have surfaced lately from Israel to go in that direction are extremely valuable and should be supported. Secondly, with regard to Turkey, I think Europe is just about to make a very grave mistake in rejecting the Turkish bid for a possible future EU ascendancy. Now, as you know, it is a long, ongoing process, but the new French government has made it quite clear just yesterday that they are not willing to continue in that direction. And the German Chancellor is more on the same track with Sarkozy there, and Turkish accession is extremely popular, extremely unpopular in Europe. I think it would be a strategic mistake to cut Turkey loose, and I think that's basically what we would be doing if we would refuse to earnestly negotiate about a European future for Turkey. And it would, of course, influence the regional security picture to a great degree and increase the dangers in the region. So I think if we want to solve the problem in Iran, we should make sure that we will not create new problems in the neighborhood, and that we use every opportunity, as in the case with Syria, to solve some of the problems that have become mingled with the Iranian threat, and that would lower this threat if possible. Thank you.
We'll take some questions. I'm going to pose my first, and then ask Helga to take over for me, if you would, and then open the floor. I agree with virtually everything you said, but I want to just ask a dynamic. You talked about keeping the UN Security Council members on board with this three-pronged approach and providing some new twist to that. It seems to me a novel idea that maybe is crossing people's minds, and I don't know what the diplomatic price would be. The really fascinating thing when it comes to North Korea and Iran is how Russia and China clicked into agreement with us on both of those, and it made a profound difference in the deal with North Korea. It also seems to have made, from what I hear, a difference in the way Iran was calculating its position. Now, that's not to say that Europe and the United States don't have a lot of weight, but it is interesting that China, perceived in the world to be an ascending power, and the United States and Europe collectively, I would say maybe they're doing great things, but I wouldn't say that ascension is part of the equation right now. Is the question of whether you think China could be coaxed into playing more of a leadership role in actually being in the front of this process and saying, if you mess with what our intentions and expectations are, we're not just going to be passive to what Europe and the United States are negotiating, but put China in the front, whether you think that has any value?
Well, thank you, Steve. I do believe that China already does play a more active role than we usually perceive over here. I was in China in May last year, and I met one of the leading Chinese experts on the Middle East and talked at length with him about Iran. At the time, the position the Chinese government took was still much more reluctant to even discuss sanctions than has turned out since. And he predicted at the time that if the West would be patient, the Chinese would come around and support that. And he's been proven right. So, it is a fact that at some point, the Chinese even sent their own emissaries to Tehran when they wouldn't listen to us, when they wouldn't listen to Solana, to indicate clearly that the Chinese were on board, not only formally, but in fact, and really believed in it. And I think it is possible to increase that role, but it is also important in order to be able to do that, to reassure the Chinese about the real purpose of the West, and particularly of the US in that context. If the Chinese are led to believe that it's about, as I said, a new patron-client relationship that we want to install there, they're going to be much more reluctant to support that than if they're convinced that this is going to be a new partnership, and that an Iran that is not as aggressive as this government is could play a positive role. And I strongly believe that the Chinese can have a role there, and therefore we should make every effort to have them included.
Floor is open. Yes, we'll go here and why don't you come on up and thank you all. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll give you 5 seconds. Okay, please. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Michael Cole. I'm from George Mason University.
There's a mic coming.
Hi. Is it working?
Yeah.
My name is Michael Cole. I'm from George Mason University. And I think you're right that it's a shame that so much of the emphasis is now placed on the nuclear debate, because there are so many other issues that could open up opportunities to kind of engage Iran. One thing that makes the United States position distinctive right now vis-a-vis Iran is that it's just that we have been so isolated from them for so long. This is not true of the Asian powers and Europe. And I wonder how you think Europe's far more complex relationships with Iran, especially in business, will change not only its role in the united efforts in this coalition of the willing to engage Iran, but also its positions.
Thank you. Well, I believe if Iran perceives the European nations, or for that matter, let's say Germany, which is the biggest trading partner they have, as nations that are exclusively defined over their trading and commercial interests, that will be very negative, because that will induce them to believe that we will accept anything as long as we can make a profit from it. So we can use the trading relationships and the engagement as one tool in the multifaceted approach of engaging them and taking them on. Engagement alone will fail, and carrots alone will not do. So but without making positive use of that, we will not get any place either.
I think there was something in the back.
Faribor Sfatemi with the Oxfordshire Group. I'm fascinated. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm fascinated by the discussion that goes on here in Washington, especially about Iran's threat and its whether it's going to get a nuclear weapon or it's not going to get a nuclear weapon, etc. They have claimed they don't want a nuclear weapon. They said it's against their religion, and there's nothing in the IEAs that says that they're embarked on that. But nevertheless, the discussion goes on, and most recently, the discussion was about the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Now, what's the view of Europe if the United States embarks on such a program? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm not that sure about Islamic religion foreclosing an Iranian bomb. We have to take into account that Pakistan is also a Muslim country and has the bomb. So I don't know how far we can trust the fatwa of the Iranian leader.
But they're Sunni. Iran is Shia. There's a difference.
Well, I accept the difference, but I still have reservations about that. If there be a use of tactical nuclear weapons to try to bomb this nuclear program, I think this would be nuking transatlantic relations. There would be no support in Europe whatsoever. I can't speak for the Europeans, but that's my take on it.
Bob Chetler, American Foreign Policy Council. I would like your thoughts on trying to disentangle the nuclear weapons in the sense that nuclear weapons, in a sense, are always used by virtue of the fact that a certain amount of prestige attaches to those powers that have them, and they are used in the sense that they implicitly threaten to be used rather than being actually used. Is there any way that Iran's interest in getting the prestige of being able to make them and in having them could be in any way addressed without, in some other way? And then in the other direction, their claim to want nuclear energy could be broadened out to some way of finding a way of enhancing their energy broadly, given their vast oil resources, in a way that also satisfies the legitimate interest for a more accessible energy for the country of Iran.
Thank you, sir. Nuclear energy is a particularly tickly issue for Green. We're completely opposed to it, and still we have to accept that other nations take their own decisions. So we're glad with the phase-out decision we have in Germany, and don't want to force it upon anybody else. But I'm not in favor of the use of nuclear energy. And I guess if we would be able to find a solid base of cooperation with Iran, we could use that to offer some of the technological alternatives that we are developing, including all different kinds of renewables. Clearly they have a technological problem. It's difficult for that nation to finance and organize technological modernization without international investment, without international help. So they put some hope on nuclear, maybe, that wouldn't necessarily go in that direction if we could open up other alternatives. With regard to the prestige dimension, I understand that, but then if we accept that in the case of Iran, what are we going to do about Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and others? And all of a sudden, you see a long procession of countries that would talk about prestige and be at least as justified as Iran or any other country to do that. And you would have quite the opposite of what we should strive for. You would have nuclear proliferation on a vast basis. I believe that there is an alternative, and it would be interesting to study more closely, I believe, the strategy that has been employed by the United States in the case of North Korea, trying to offer to them an alternative route. In the case of North Korea, which has a government that is at least as much opposed to our way of life as the Iranians, more so, I believe, since North Korean youth probably have not as much information about the American or the Western way of life as Iranian youth. The United States have been willing to offer some security guarantees. And of course, the material basis of the prestige issue is security. So if you can provide a solution that offers more security than the present situation, I think the prestige problem might shrink.
Can I ask you something? Because I think for me in the past years or months, one of the main differences I saw between the way Iran was discussed in Europe and the way Iran was discussed here in the US was the sense of urgency, the time question. I think certainly here in the US administration, one can see a change. There's less pressure to solve the Iran question in the next year. But I wonder how is that perceived in Germany? What's your sense? We have come closer on the urgency, the time that we got to try negotiations, sanctions, shadow sanctions, etc.
I don't believe that this is the major difference. I do recall that a couple of years ago, even Joschka Fischer, when he still was the German foreign minister, quite clearly expressed the sense of urgency over the Iranian nuclear program. And he was a very clearly heard voice telling the Europeans that we couldn't stand aside, that we had to get involved and go beyond negotiating as we had. So the sense of urgency is probably not the biggest difference. I think the biggest difference probably lies in the perception of our ability to somehow, quote unquote, solve the problem. And there is a perception over here that in the end there's always a way of keeping them from getting where they want to get. And the Europeans are much more skeptical, I would say, with regard to that. And as I expressed, a few people would believe in Europe that we can make sure we will keep them from getting close to the bomb. So we try to discuss a broader variety of avenues to get to them and to induce them to even though they may have the ability to not use that ability. And maybe we have been too forbearing in the past with regard to the goal that we explicitly put forward. Is the goal to prevent Iran from using nuclear power to the full extent that the NPT allows? Sometimes people have got that impression. I think that would be not the right goal. Is the goal to keep Iran from developing the ability to close the fuel cycle? It may have been the right goal, but it's not attainable anymore, I would say. So I think the goal that we can clearly pursue would be the goal of preventing the Iranians from getting the bomb, and this is still possible.
Can the Israelis live with what you mentioned as the second thing, that we cannot probably avoid them having the knowledge of the war?
This is very difficult. I talked on my last visit to Israel. I talked with one of their leading Iranian experts, and he explained that he believed that the danger of Iran annihilating Israel, as the Iranian president had promised a couple of times, probably was not real. He said, well, think. First, we are a nuclear power. Second, we have a second strike ability. Third, we are under the protective shield of the United States. Even if our second strike ability would fail, there would still be the United States to take care of that. So do you really believe the Iranians would take all that risk? And then he ended by saying, but can I guarantee an Israeli prime minister that this argument is valid? And of course, he cannot, and neither of us can. But there is this old Latin saying from the Middle Ages, ultra posse nemo obligatur. If it's not possible to do a thing, you're not obliged to do it.
Okay, please.
I'm Al Richmond, former State Department Office of Research. There are various viewpoints as to what Iranian leaders' motives are. Some contend that the radicals, as you call, or the ideological conservatives now in power, are not that eager for an agreement with the West, particularly the U.S. And in fact, they want to play off the U.S. in enhancing their position in the Muslim world. Thus, our assumptions about the sanctions that might be effective may be optimistic. The second point I'd like to make is that the Pew surveys and the German Marshall Fund surveys have shown that European publics are as concerned as the American public about an Iranian nuclear weapon. And then when they were asked the question by the German Marshall Fund, if non-military methods did not work, would you be willing to support military action? Support, well, not a majority, about 2/5 was as high in Europe as it is in the U.S., at least in Europe among Germany, France, and about the same level.
Thank you, sir. With regard to the motives, I would tend to agree with your first point, that the radicals are probably not interested, because they use the hatred as a resource for staying in power. So then the question is, can we find a strategy that would weaken the radicals and promote alternatives in a transformation process, as I mentioned before? I think the radicals are in unison with almost everybody else, including the largest part of the opposition, that there is a need for Iranian hegemony in the region. That is not a view taken by the radicals alone. And because of that, it is questionable whether we can get a solution if we cannot separate this radical perspective from the perspective that is has much wider support in Iran, in the political class, and in the population. And then I believe for Ahmadinejad, the rhetoric that attacks Israel so brutally is a means of portraying himself as the true representative of that desire for regional hegemony. In fact, if he attacks what Ayatollah Khomeini had called the little Satan, he portrays himself as the leader for the Arab masses in all the countries, including the Sunni countries. He can't possibly get out and say, well, we want to be the dominating power in this region, but if he collects support from the Arab street for a purpose that he uses to endear himself to their aspirations, then of course it serves a wider perspective. And because of that, I think there is probably an ideological dimension to this attack and brutal language concerning Israel, but there's also this kind of tactical dimension to that. With regard to your second point, I can only speak from my own experience and from what I see particularly in the German public opinion, and I would not hesitate to say that probably right now the prestige of America and Germany is at a lower ebb than it has ever been since the end of the Vietnam War with the general public. notwithstanding good relations between the chancellor and the president and productive cooperation on a good number of issues, if you go to the guts, there's a huge problem. And this would be severely increased. I'm positively convinced of that.
We have another here.
My name's Gabriel Sassoon, and I'm an intern with GINSA, Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs. I suspect that personally I would be in agreement with you on many issues of domestically and on other international issues from what I heard about your environmental views and so forth. But and clearly you would prefer on this issue for the Iranians not to have a bomb. Clearly there's a preference for that, a strong preference, it sounds like. But some of what I've heard is troubling as far as this issue is concerned, because what I'm hearing, and perhaps you can correct me, what I'm hearing is that you said that there's a saying that you're not obliged to do what is not possible, and that's where there's a divergence between the US and European views on this matter. And I wonder whether in Europe there's a real understanding or not even understanding, but acceptance perhaps of the Islamist danger here. And what I've heard a lot is excuses for the rhetoric, discussing the tactical reasons for the rhetoric rather than taking it seriously. And I think as someone who, as a Jew and as someone who is pro-Israel and someone who's lost members of my family in the Holocaust, I personally tend to take seriously when someone, when a particular dictator suggests that he wants to wipe the Jewish people off the face of the earth, particularly in light of history. And so my question is, would so many Europeans really be prepared, if it's not, quote unquote possible to end this this possibility of an Iranian bomb? Would so many Europeans really be prepared to live with an Islamic radical nuclear state?
First of all, with regard to what you call the acceptance of Islamism in Europe, I clearly don't think I have expressed anything of the kind, and that's not my position. When I discuss that rhetoric, it's not with the purpose of not taking it seriously, but with the purpose of analyzing what's in it. And as I said, there is this tactical dimension in that rhetoric. And I use that to explain that he's playing on certain feelings of the Iranian people that are shared by a wider segment in the Iranian population. But I also said that you have to take that rhetoric not only from that tactical analysis, but to take it seriously, and we do. And I myself am representing a party that has strongly opposed the Iraq War. You know all that. But when I was questioned in November of 2002 whether I could exclude categorically participation in an upcoming Iraqi war in 2002, I said that I would not. And that if Saddam Hussein would attack Israel, I felt we should be on the side of Israel, including militarily. So I don't take the position that this doesn't count or this is not of our concerns. I have, I think, a very serious understanding of the threat to Israel. But then it's not an issue between Israelis and Europeans. At the Herzliya conference that I mentioned, not only did President Peres, who then wasn't the president yet, say that he didn't feel Israel had a problem with the Iranian people. Other experts from Israel expressed that they did not believe that there should be a use of military force because it wouldn't work and because it wouldn't produce the right results. So I refuse to accept that this is a question of either being Israeli or accepting Israeli perspectives or being European or American for that purpose. And I think if we're not allowed to have a serious discussion over the details of the problem, we're hampering ourselves. And I take this from a position of solidarity, and I still believe that the sentence I cited from St. Thomas is right. It is an illusion to promise to deliver if you can't. And here I believe we should not narrow our minds to the military dimension. And one of the purposes of this discussion we're having, I believe, is to understand that there still are more options on the table than just this one. I mentioned the question of Turkey. Are we making the problem more difficult by basically kicking the Turks out? And where are they going to go? I talked about human rights issues. I talked about American dialogue with Iran. This is not just a European view, you know that. It's been a part of the report that the president scrapped from his own experts. So I believe we're not at the point where we have to settle for the dire alternative. Either we go to war or we accept Iranian radicals wielding the bomb. I believe we can keep Iran from getting the bomb, which is more than saying we can keep the radicals from getting the bomb.
Thank you, Robert Shredder, international investor. I came in a little late, so if you had mentioned this already, forgive me, but there is a timeline here, and it has to do with the presidential election in our country. How likely do you believe it is that the Iranians would work with this administration? Wouldn't they prefer to play for time and see who the next president is? And the converse of that is, or the flip side, I guess we'd say, is how much pressure is building on this current administration to take action before it leaves office?
Thank you, sir. If the Iranians were smart, they would prefer working with this administration, because they know that if they get a deal with this administration that is so adversarial, they have a deal. And I don't know whether the groundworks can be laid fast enough to make that possible, but I would love to see that. With regard to the second part of your question, I don't think there is a lot of pressure on this administration, but there might be pressure from within. There might be pressure from President Bush himself and his understanding of his historic role. He has compared himself to President Lincoln, and obviously believes he's the Lincoln of the 21st century. And as unpopular as Lincoln was at his time, he is now, but history will tell he was right. If that's the perception, I'm not sure whether pressure from without is that much relevant, and whether it's not internal dimensions that sort of shape the process. I'm no expert on that. I hear that there's a lot of pressure within the administration, and particularly within the military, not to go in that direction.
Okay, if there's no other questions, maybe just one thing, because you mentioned human rights, and I wonder how much really one can do from the outside these days. The reports of what's happening in Iran are rather troubling, of how Ahmadinejad is going against students or others. How much one can really do, and maybe your final words.
We cannot do a lot from without, but there's one thing we could do for sure. We could create a new focus. How much do the politicians or even the general public know about resistance within Iran? How much do we know about strikes? How much do we know about women's groups opposing the regime on specific issues? We care much more for every word that Ahmadinejad utters than for all these expressions of the will to be free within Iran. And I think we should have this second focus. We shouldn't care less about Ahmadinejad, but we could care more about the Iranians that are not in his boat and are working in the different direction. And we could give exposure to that, and we could express support of that. And I think it would clearly make a difference if we would be understood as supporting progressive movements within the Iranian nation, within the Iranian people. It would make it more difficult for the hardliners in Iran to portray this conflict as a conflict between Islam and the West, or between the Iranian nation and the West. We're not the enemy of the Iranian people. We want to be friends with the Iranian people, but we want to get rid of the radicals.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure, of course, and you join me in thanking Reinhard.